My name is Michael Fernandez, and I'm the director of the Center for Scientific Evidence and Public Issues here at the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In today's lecture, Dr. Christina Grozinger, entomology professor and director of the Huck Institutes of the Life Sciences at Penn State University, will delve deeper into the fascinating world of pollinators, how they function, why they are at risk, and what we can do to support them. And following Dr. Grozinger's lecture, we will have what I know will be a lively panel discussion here and a question and answer session. So be ready with your questions. I will also be monitoring questions online. So for those of you online, please submit them through the question feature in the Zoom, and I will be asking them in this room. So whether you're here out of passion for protecting pollinators or simply out of curiosity to learn more, I promise you'll leave with a deeper appreciation of their role in maintaining a healthy planet. I know that you're all eager to hear from our lecturer and the panelists, but I do need to take one more moment to thank some of the many people who make this lecture possible. First, Daniel Robeson, president of the Charles Valentine Riley Memorial Foundation. This lecture builds on a long history between AAAS and Charles Valentine Riley, who was dedicated to enhancing agriculture through scientific knowledge, and also served as the vice president of our biology section in 1888. Our shared mission of promoting science and innovation for the benefit of all is as strong today as it was then, and we are proud to collaborate with the Riley Memorial Foundation. I'd also like to thank the World Food Pride Foundation, our other partner in this lecture, and members of AAAS's section on agriculture, food, and renewable resources, who provide valuable guidance and expertise. Most importantly, I'd like to thank the members of the AAAS meetings team, and especially Joanna Marquez Mello, standing at the back, on my team, who makes all of this possible. Everything you see here tonight and all day today is their doing. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Robeson to get us started.
Nice to see you all. This is really a happy occasion and a wonderful opportunity to be together. Those of you here in the room, and I think we have about an equal number of people online. So this is a terrific event. My name is Dan Robeson. I have the pleasure, as introduced, of being the president of the Riley Memorial Foundation, and I also serve as dean of the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at Iowa State University. And this is always a wonderful event each fall that we do here at the AAAS building. I want to recognize, as Michael did already, that there are some people who make this possible. We have in the audience with us some board members from the Riley Foundation. There are certainly people from AAAS here as well. And let's just all give them a round of applause of thanks. This lecture was endowed by a granddaughter of C.V. Riley himself. C.V. Riley came from England. Some of his children went back to the UK. And one of them, through a variety of means, endowed this lecture in the 1980s. And so we are here because literally not only of Riley's family, Riley's legacy, but Riley's family as well. It's an interesting part of this story. We are here to think about C.V. Riley and how he inspired people then and continues to inspire them now to do work in the broad realms of agriculture, natural resources, economics, policy, and so on. In 1872, Riley said the following: "None but the well-informed are successful in agriculture. For success in agriculture today," he meant 1872, we mean 2025, "for success in agriculture today requires knowledge, that being scientific knowledge." So Riley was at, and we too are at, the intersection of science and policy and how we do good things on our landscapes to support our communities. He is an inspiration to us today, as he was then in his own lifetime. The policy roundtable we held this afternoon is evidence of that, as well as this lecture. The roundtable this afternoon, moderated by my colleague on the Riley board, Lowell Randall from Texas Tech University, and included Karsten Fort from the American Soybean Association, Josie Montaney from the U.S. House Agricultural Committee, Kathy Simons from National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and a special member of our panel this afternoon, the Honorable Dr. Scott Hutchins, USDA Undersecretary for Research, Education, and Economics, and Chief Scientist at USDA. And Scott Hutchins is here. Scott, would you be recognized, please? And let's welcome the Honorable Scott Hutchins. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to have you with us. Let me tell you a bit more about this person, C.V. Riley. I always want to introduce him as Dr. C.V. Riley, but in fact, he had elementary and high school level education in Europe and received no more formal education afterwards. So his achievements are all the more remarkable. He's a self-taught, self-made scientist and leader, a remarkable person. We recognize him as a Renaissance person, a person who accomplished much, much more than anybody would ever imagine he could have. Born in England in 1843, he came to Chicago at age 17 in 1860, and he found work and made work there as a farm laborer, a journalist, an illustrator in magazines. He began his lifelong interest in poetry, and in particular, for some reason, he took a shine to the study of insects, entomology. Just a few short years after arriving here, he enlisted in the Union Army in 1864 and served during the Civil War. By 1868, he had become the state entomologist for Missouri, a remarkable rise. Soon after, in 1876, he began his time here in Washington, D.C., and he spent the next 21 years here doing remarkable things until his tragic death in a bicycle accident, and he was only 51 years old. Imagine what he might have achieved if he had lived longer. He was here in Washington, D.C., doing a number of things that transformed how we think about science and technology and its play in the natural world. Every student of entomology knows the story of C.V. Riley. You cannot open an introductory textbook and not know about C.V. Riley. And in fact, Dr. Scott Hutchins, who I just introduced to you, remarked in a phone call the other day that one of the reasons he's here is if it's about Riley, he needs to be here. And I think entomologists worldwide feel that way as well. Riley did the following things while he was here in Washington, D.C., in addition, with his wife, Emily Koppelman, of having 7 children. He founded the Office of the Experiment Stations at USDA. He founded the U.S. Entomological Commission. He founded the U.S. Office on Economic Ornithology. He founded the National Insect Collection at the Smithsonian, served as its curator for many, many years, and donated his own collection to the Smithsonian. He was one of the founders of one of the 2 organizations that today are the National Entomological Society of America. He pioneered what is now a fundamental part of biocontrol, a fundamental part of integrated pest management, that being biocontrol. He developed pesticide sprayer technology. He studied the coevolution of insects, particularly mimicry, and wrote the key story on the viceroy and monarch butterflies, which you should all know, and if you don't, you should Google it up. He worked on and helped to resolve the phylloxera problem in grapes and saved the European wine industry. He worked on cottony cushion scale and saved the citrus industry with the Vidalia beetle. He worked on mountain locust ecology and management, and so much more. There are many, many other things that I could mention. He is credited with over 2,400 publications. So those of you who like to write publications, you now have a new benchmark. So I'm now going to transition and introduce our distinguished speaker this evening, and I'll ask Dr. Christina Grozinger to please join me here on the podium. Dr. Grozinger is the Publius Virgilius Maro, and that's fun to say. You can see it up there. Publius Virgilius Maro, professor of entomology at Penn State University, and serves as the director of the Huck Institute for Life Sciences, director and founder of the Center for Pollinator Research, and director and founder of the Penn State Insect Biodiversity Institute. Her work has transformed how we understand the threads that connect the underlying biology and ecology of landscape-level plant-insect systems, particularly with respect to pollinators and especially with respect to bees. She will speak to us this evening on this critically important and indeed fascinating topic. Dr. Grozinger shared with me that when she started out studying protein chemistry, but became fascinated by honeybees from the stories of her brother, who was an apiculturist, and she changed her career trajectory to do what she now will talk to us about. Dr. Grozinger received her BS from McGill University in biology and chemistry, doctorate from Harvard in chemistry and chemical biology. She was a Beckman Fellow at the University of Illinois and a faculty member at North Carolina State University. She is a key member on science committees for the Entomological Society of America, for our national academies, and for the USDA. She is a fellow of the Entomological Society of America, and like C.V. Riley, a fellow of the AAAS. She was awarded the prestigious 2021 National Academy of Sciences Prize in Food and Agriculture, which was endowed by the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research and the Gates Foundation. Please help me welcome Dr. Grozinger.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I'm so happy to be here with you tonight to honor the incredible legacy of C.V. Riley and to talk with you about plants, pollinators, and people. We're going to start our journey with the plants. So we have over 300,000 flowering plant species in the world, and they come in a whole variety of different colors and shapes and scents. We've bred these plants to produce our fruit, vegetable, and nut crops, and the beautiful plants that we have in our gardens and in our bouquets. These serve as the basis of our terrestrial food webs as well. And so when we think about what led to this incredible biodiversity of plants, we have to thank our pollinators. So 90% of flowering plants use pollinators to move their pollen from one flower to the next. And so all of these colors and these scents and these shapes are basically the plants competing with each other to try to attract their pollinators. And when the pollinator visits the plant, they're rewarded with nectar, which is a source of carbohydrates. And in most cases, they'll incidentally pick up the pollen and move it to the next flower. But in the case of bees, they've actually specially evolved to collect the pollen and take it back to their nest as a source of protein and fats for their babies. And so this mutualism between flowering plants and bees really led to this biodiversity explosion of both of these species, and then again, the rest of our terrestrial ecosystems. And so I'm going to focus a lot on bees for this talk, but I want to make sure that everyone understands that we have a lot of different types of pollinators. So bees, again, are one of the most important ones because we have so many kinds of bees in the world, and also because they are moving pollen in these large quantities. But flies are our second most important pollinators. Butterflies, moths, and beetles are also really important. Bats are important pollinators in tropical regions, and then, of course, hummingbirds. And in islands ecosystems where you don't have some of these traditional pollinators available, the plants will evolve to attract other animals to serve as their pollinators. As humans, we are a pollinator-dependent species. So most mammals have dichromatic vision, which means they see the world. It's in this bottom photograph here. But primates have evolved trichromatic vision, which probably evolved to allow them to find these ripe fruits and vegetables in their environment. Most of our vitamins are coming from pollinated foods, and so when we consider vitamin deficiencies or nutrient deficiencies, really it's a deficiency in pollinated foods. 75% of our major food crops use pollinators, and so this is everything from our typical fruits and vegetables that we would normally think about, like our apples and tomatoes and watermelons, but it's also things that require pollination to set seed, like our carrots and broccoli. Our tree nuts, almonds, are one of the most important pollinated crops that we have in the US. Coffee beans, cacao beans, and if you enjoy your cocktails, the bats are important pollinators of agave, which is used to make tequila. Our dairy cattle are fed alfalfa, which also requires pollination to set seed. And then pollinators are important for our fiber crops, such as cotton, and for some of our timber crops, such as black cherry, which is one of the most important economic timber crops in the Northwest or Northeast. So in total, pollinators contribute somewhere around 200 to 400 billion to global agriculture, depending on how you calculate it, and about 34 billion to US agriculture. We've had a long relationship with bees. So over 9,000 years ago, we find cave paintings of people doing honey harvesting, right, and collecting honey from wild honeybee colonies. But we also have these examples like honey guide birds in Africa who have evolved to give a special call to lead people with them as they go find honeybee colonies in the wild, and then they get rewarded with some pieces of wax and honey from those colonies. We also have evidence of beekeeping in Egypt from 4,500 years ago. And of course, now in modern times, we are moving bees around at an amazing rate. And so this is an example of the movements of bees from across the US to California for almond bloom to ensure that we can have full pollination of those trees. And again, I'm focusing a lot on honeybees for this. But we have managed and worked with multiple different kinds of bee species. So stingless bees are used for honey production in tropical areas. We've commercialized orchard bees, bumblebees, and alfalfa leaf-cutting bees for pollination services. And in the US, we're the only, we have the only example of a ground nesting managed bees, which are alkali bees. And you can see their ground nests up here. And these are used for pollination of alfalfa. So unfortunately, despite the importance of pollinators for our crops and our natural ecosystems and their cultural importance, we have a lot of evidence for pollinator declines across the world. So a recent study looked at the observations of bee species worldwide in recent years, and they found that there were 25% fewer bee species that were being observed compared to the 1990s. In the US, 30 to 50% of managed honeybee colonies die every winter. And this last year, we actually had the highest rates on record, which was 62%. And this seems to have been caused by a parasitic mite that our honeybees have that is normally managed by a miticide. And so these mites may have become resistant to that. 26% of North American bumblebee species are showing declines. And a recent study that was published in Science showed that there were 22% fewer butterflies in the US now than there were 20 years ago. So again, all of this is showing that we're seeing these declines both in our managed and wild pollinators and in all sorts of different species and taxa. I will point out, we do have some species that are actually expanding, and I think there's a lot of interest in the scientific community to try to understand what makes some species winners in this changing environment and what is causing other ones to become to go into decline. So what do we know about pollinator decline? So there's many, many factors that are underlying this. Environmental factors such as land use change are really probably the most important ones. And so these land use changes result in decreased abundance and diversity of flowering plants, which again, the bees and other pollinators need as their food resources. Lack of nesting habitat, so 70% of our bees live in the ground, and so they have to have access to the right kind of ground to dig their tunnels in. Our butterflies and moths are laying their eggs on specific kinds of host plants, and so if those are absent from the environment, they also can't reproduce. And then, of course, if there's pesticides, which we need to use to manage pests in our crops, they can have off-target effects on our beneficial insects. And we're learning more and more every day about the impacts of heavy metals and air pollution on our pollinators. We're also seeing effects of weather and climate, which are both on the pollinators themselves, but maybe more importantly, on the flowering plants that they depend on. And they have parasites and pathogens like the mite that I was telling you about. And then we also have examples of invasive species. So there's a new species called the yellow-legged hornet that was introduced into the southeastern US that's really creating problems for our beekeepers there. We also know that high-quality pollinator habitat in the US has been in decline. So this was a study that was done by In-Soo Ko, where he collected data on, or he mapped out across the US high-quality habitat in terms of the floral resources and nesting habitat for bees, and looked for how this habitat was changing from 2008 to 2013. And in red are areas where there are declines, and you can see there's quite a lot of red across US. Maggie Douglas, who's an associate professor at Dickinson College, mapped out the toxic load of applied insecticides across the US and looked at the change from 1997 to 2012. And again, you can see that there are parts of the Midwest and the Great Plains where there's a significant increase in the toxicity of the pesticides that are being applied. Beekeepers have also said that it's becoming harder and harder for them to create a honey crop. And so Gabriela Quinlan, who's one of our panelists tonight, thought, we actually have the data to test whether or not this is accurate. And so she collected data from the National Agricultural Statistics Service on honey production and integrated this with data from a number of national data sources that provide information on land use, crop type, pesticide use, and also weather, and integrated all of this to test this claim that nectar resources have declined. And what Gabriela found was that indeed they have. So when she mapped this out across the US and looked at the average amount of honey being produced by a colony, there's been a dramatic decline since the late 1990s into 2020. And the background lines are showing you the changes within each individual state. You can see there's a lot of variation, so there's a lot of factors that are going into this, but again, overall, there's been a decline on average, the amount of honey that our beekeepers can produce per colony. Gabriela did a lot of statistics to work this out using the machine learning models and looked at these different factors and developed this model. So basically in our different ecoregions, we have different climates and different soils, and that supports different kinds of floral communities. And that sets the baseline for what nectar is available. How we manage those communities in terms of our land use also changes what's available in those ecoregions. And then even if you have flowering plants that are supporting your honey production, these can be affected by weather and by herbicide use. And so all of these factors together are influencing the honey production and the floral resources that are available for our bees. Studies from my lab and from other labs have also shown that if bees have access to high-quality pollen diets, so meaning diets that are made from multifloral pollen, they're more resistant to many of the stressors that we are concerned about. So they're more resistant to pesticides, parasites, pathogens, and Gabriela also showed that they're more resistant to extreme heat if they have this high-quality pollen diet. So that leads to the question, how can we get more pollinator-supporting plants into our landscapes? And so we've done a number of different studies to try to identify what are the best plants for pollinators. The first set of studies that we did were done by Anthony Vaudot when he was a USDA-funded doctoral student in my lab. And he was testing the hypothesis that bees were following this nutritional geometric framework. And this has been shown in other animals, but not for bees at the time that he was doing this work. And the framework basically says that the animals will forage in the environment to collect nutrition at ratios of macronutrients that are best for their particular species. And so Anthony looked at this using bumblebees, and he found that indeed bumblebees were foraging across different flowering plants to achieve a particular ratio of proteins to lipids in their pollen. And so this seemed to be, for that species, a major driver of how they were choosing which plants that they would forage on. So we've done this with other species as well, and we found that it works for many, but not all. We have some species that we call them sort of nutritional gluttons. They just try to eat whatever is available to them. And so this is really interesting to understand the nutritional ecology, but it's also really labor intensive to try to do these studies. So we wanted to find faster ways that we could identify the plants that our bees were using. And so Doug Sponsler, when he was a USDA-funded postdoc in my lab, developed a DNA metabarcoding approach where you can take the pollen that the bees are collecting or the honey that they have made and process it and do high-throughput sequencing on it to identify all the botanical sources that they were collecting that pollen and honey from. And so this is just an example of the work that he did looking at urban beekeeping in Philadelphia. But I just wanted to point out that when I showed this to our beekeepers, they really wanted to have access to this technology because they're really interested in making specialty honey. And so we streamlined this protocol to make it an actual diagnostic lab protocol. So if anyone is interested, you can send us your samples at the Penn State Honey and Pollen Diagnostic Lab, and we can process that for you. But we also worked with a lot of plant breeders who are interested in understanding for their plants, what is the pollinator attractiveness of those plants. And so this was a project that was funded by the USDA SCRI program. And this was work that was done by Emily Erickson when she was a graduate student in the lab. She is now an ecologist at Second Nature Ecology and Design. And so her project was to evaluate the pollinators that were coming to different ornamental plant species and stocks. And we joke that she basically sat on a bucket in the field for like 4 years and just counted the insects that were coming to these different plant species. And when we started this project, we thought that, these ornamental plants are being bred for our pleasure and not for pollinators. And so we thought they would be not attractive to pollinators or not have the nutritional resources that they needed. But in fact, some of these plants were more attractive than the nativars. And we had a lot of variation in different species and in cultivars. And so just to give you an example of what this looks like, the top graph shows 6 cultivars that were our highest performing cultivars in Emily's study. And on each column is a different bee species. And so if you made a garden with these 6 cultivars, you could attract 80 different bee species, including several that are specialists or rare in the landscape. If you took the same species, but you picked our lowest performing cultivars and made a garden out of those, you would only attract 20 bee species, and many of these are the generalist ones that you find in most places. So by making these different choices, we can have really different outcomes in terms of the biodiversity of the gardens that we can make. So we then started to think, how can we better support our plant breeders? So ornamental plant breeders are producing new stocks every year. So at Penn State, we are the home to the flower trials that serve the northeastern US, and we get about 700 different plants every year to evaluate. And they're being evaluated on many different traits, but they're not being evaluated for their pollinator attractiveness because it takes too long. So Emily worked with her data and analyzed it and tried to understand how she could streamline the protocol to be as fast as possible and as accurate as possible to make it feasible for our plant assessors to actually do this kind of analysis during the course of their regular assessments. And so she was able to reduce the protocol to about 10 minutes, and we've developed an app called Flora Count around this, which should be available in December. And the app basically walks people through the process and also stores all the data. One critical feature of this is that we have to control for floral area. So if you have a plant that has 1 flower versus 100 flowers, you're going to get different numbers of pollinators just from having that huge difference in flowers. And so the way that we have analyzed this in the past is by doing basic image processing. It takes a really long time. So now we've developed an AI-enabled approach for this. This was developed by Edward Amoa, who's a postdoc in my lab, where basically within a few seconds, the AI algorithm identifies the flowers, identifies a reference object, and processes out the floral area. And so our hope with this is that we're going to be able to give our ornamental plant breeders the tools that they need to use science to advertise whether or not their plants are good plants for pollinators and also for which kinds of pollinators. And we know this is important because people will pay more for pollinator-friendly plants in the market. So it's great if you can identify which single plants are really good for pollinators, but as I mentioned before, they're in these mutualistic networks, right? And so if we look at a plant pollinator community, what you see here is sort of this community mapped out across the course of a growing season. This was work that was done by Laura Russo when she was a graduate student at Penn State. And in red are different plant species, and in orange are different bee species. And the yellow bars are showing the interactions between these. So different bees go to different plants, and different plants attract different bees. And work that's been done by Jordi Boscomte and others have shown that if we have a well-structured network, meaning it's nested and modular, it's more resistant and less likely to collapse. So how do we design these nested pollinator communities? So I'm really happy to have Claudia Vest from Phyto Studios here as part of our panel. So Phyto Studios is a DC-based landscape ecology or architecture firm. And one of their goals is to use pollinator science to develop biodiverse habitats. And so Claudia gave me some of the principles for biodiverse habitat design that she uses. And so this is having a lot of habitat heterogeneity, having a lot of diversity of your flowering plants, having plants that are blooming across the growing season so they can support all the different kinds of pollinators, have high coverage of these plants that are attractive to a lot of different kinds of pollinators, and then use pollinator-friendly planting maintenance. So this means low inputs of chemicals. But I'm sure she'd be happy to discuss this more during the panel. Okay, so how do we know if our local landscape needs more spring blooming plants or fall blooming plants? Or if we're a beekeeper, how do we know if we need to supplement our bees at some point during the growing season? So that was a question that motivated us in designing this project called Beescape. And this is a project that we've been working on for many years. It's multi-PI in multiple universities. And we've brought together entomologists, ecologists, ecological statisticians, people who do user-centered design into this group in order to try to develop something where we can take all of those landscape layers that Gabriela was using in the study I talked about before and put them into some format that regular people and growers and stakeholders can use. And so if you go to our Center for Pollinary Research website, you can look at Beescape. It works across the continental United States. You navigate to the site that you're interested in and highlight the area that you want to get information on. And then Beescape will automatically calculate out for you and color in the land use categories in the area that you've highlighted. And it also gives you information on habitat quality scores and gives you relative information about those scores. So in this case, we have sort of average nesting availability for wild bees. We have good spring and summer floral resources. We are low on the fall floral resources, and we have low pesticide risk. We also pulled out information on the economic value that pollinators are providing to the crops in this area, and we have climate information from the last year, the previous year, and the 10-year normal. And you can also navigate through this and highlight different habitat traits that you'd be interested in. So in this case, we're highlighting the fall floral resources and where those are, so you can determine how close you are to these, to an area that might provide support for your bees. We're also pulling in data from iNaturalist that gives us information on what plants are flowering in the area and then also what pollinators are present in the area. And we're hoping in the future to add in information about forecasting plant blooms, so beekeepers also know when to predict a honey flow. So when we were developing Beescape, what we really wanted was to be able to tell people how many bees they can expect in their area that they've selected. But getting that information is really quite challenging, right? So going back to Gabriela's graph, if we think about all the factors that go into how many bees and what diversity of bees and other pollinators you have in a particular area, we need to have data that's covering multiple ecoregions, covering a lot of different types of land use categories, and we need data from multiple years to take into account weather variation. And we really don't have a lot of those data sets available to us. So one that is available is coming from the USGS Bee Monitoring Lab, which is in Maryland. And this is really one of the best data sets that we have in the US for wild bees. And so we use these data to try to understand, again, what are the major landscape and weather drivers of bee abundance and diversity. And one of the things we found is it really depends on which bee species you're looking at, right? So their natural history really influences how these different environmental factors are impacting them. We also, you can use citizen science to get these large data sets. So we've had this really great collaboration with our beekeepers in Pennsylvania where they provide a survey or they answer a survey with information about their management practices and their winter losses and their locations, which we then can study. And so using this, we've been able to identify management strategies that they can use to reduce winter survival and make their colonies resilient to a range of weather conditions. But again, in both of these cases, even though we had a lot of data, we didn't have enough data to actually have a predictive model. So these machine learning AI approaches are really, really data hungry. And so this challenge of trying to get more and better data is something that was discussed in a lot of detail at this National Academy of Sciences and Royal Society supported workshop that happened in May. I encourage you to look at the website for this. And this was focusing on trying to understand how we can measure biodiversity to address the global biodiversity crisis. I would say you can swap this out and also say, how do we measure things for precision ag as well? Because it's the same kind of problems. And so this study is currently in review, but one of the transformations or the transformative things that was recommended was to fill data gaps by using emerging technologies to increase our capacity. So right now, if you want to measure pollinator abundance and diversity at a certain site, you have to do lethal sampling. You have to physically go to that site. You collect all the insects and you separate them out and pin them out and identify them to species. So it is a very laborious process, and you're not really getting very fine-grained data from it. So to address this, at Penn State, we've started developing AI-enabled monitoring systems, taking some of the traditional monitoring systems and adjusting them so that they're no longer lethal, but the insects, when they come into the traps, they walk through a camera system and get their pictures taken or their videos taken, and then AI processes that information to tell us what species were there. And that allows us to get data at a really fine temporal scale, at the second scale if we want it, and then it's all automated so we can put these devices out at multiple locations. We're really fortunate to get funding from the NSF Research Training Program for this. So this is a 5-year funded graduate program that's called Interdisciplinary Studies in Entomology, Computer Science, and Technology Network, or InsectNet. And I encourage you to look at the website to see some of these different devices that our students have been developing. So to conclude, I just wanted to sort of reflect on what are our opportunities for pollinator research, management, and conservation. So I started as an assistant professor in 2004, and 2006 is when the National Academy of Sciences published their Status of Pollinators in North America report, and when beekeepers reported colony collapse disorder, which at that point was the worst losses that they had experienced up until last winter. And so at the time, we really had a lot of unknowns, and we didn't have that many resources available to us to try to address those. We were really excited because the honeybee genome had been sequenced that same winter, and it was the third sequenced insect genome, and it really allowed us to understand at the molecular and physiological level how bees were being impacted by these different stressors. But now we have so many new resources. So there's the Genome project that's being run through the USDA AAAS. There's the Earth Biogenome project that's also collecting data and generating sequences from multiple bee and other pollinator species. So again, more resources to work with. We have new technologies like these new AI-enabled systems that I just talked about. We also are really fortunate in the US that we have these interdisciplinary training programs like the NSF one that I just talked about, but also USDA funds these. And so when we're really thinking about how to address these challenges going forward, we need to have our students trained not only in the latest emerging technologies, but also in the ability to work together in collaborative teams. We have excellent infrastructure through our USDA ARS labs, and again, we have these national data resources that work across the US that give us information about weather and land use and pesticide use that we can integrate in developing our models. And we also have an excellent framework that's been set up for national collaboration. So this framework has been developed over the last 10 years. So in 2015, the White House released the National Strategy to Promote Pollinator Health, which really catalyzed a lot of these subsequent events. And so in 2018, the Farm Bill laid out these pollinator health charges and a new departmental coordination effort. In 2020, the National Native Bee Monitoring Network was formed with funding from USDA. In 2022, the National Center for Pollination Conservation was formed in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And then in 2024, the USDA established a pollinator subcommittee within their NARI board. So again, we have the framework, we have the tools, we have the data. And so this is a really exciting time, I think, to be a pollinator scientist. And what do we want to do with that? So I think the next challenge for us is to start to develop these stakeholder-specific decision support tools. And so that means our beekeepers, our growers, our plant breeders, our landscape architects, we need to be able to give them information that they can use in real time at their locations to develop better management systems and better landscape design systems to support our pollinators. And in the background of all of this, we've also become more aware of broader insect biodiversity losses. So pollinators are very important for producing the seeds and the nuts and the fruits that we need and our wildlife needs, but insects as a whole, as E.O. Wilson said, are the little engines that run the world, right? So they serve also as the basis of food webs, they do nutrient cycling, they're involved in pest control. But again, we're finding, as the more we look at this, we're finding the declines or shifts in the distribution of those insects. So I'm very excited to see what happens with the National Academies of Sciences report on the status of insects in North America, which should come out next year. And I'm hoping this will be a watershed moment, just like the status of pollinators in North America report was. And so I think I've managed to thank most of the people that contributed to the research that I was sharing with you, but I wanted to especially highlight our funding sources. So we were very fortunate to receive funding from a number of agencies. These projects that I told you about, I made them sound really easy and short because I only had 30 minutes, but these were all multi-year projects, again, with multiple people involved, including several students and postdocs, and so we're really lucky to have funding from the USDA and NSF, especially graduate and postdoctoral fellowships that went to the individual people that worked on these projects, funding from the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, from the Pennsylvania Department of Ag and the Pollinator Partnership Program, the Human Science Frontier, and from several industry groups that we have worked with and partnered with, including Wyman's, Ernst Conservation Seeds, Horticultural Research Institute, Lavender by the Bay, and then several anonymous donors. And if you're interested in learning more, you can go to our Center for Pollinator Research, but if you really want plant information, I encourage you to go to the Master Gardener Extension programs at your own land-grant university because they'll be specific for your location. There's also great resources that are available on the Pollinator Partnership and Xerces Society website, as well as the National Center for Pollinator Conservation. I invite you to join us at the 2026 International Conference on Pollinator Biology, Health, and Policy, which was founded at Penn State, is being hosted next year at Montana State, so you can come for the science but stay for Yellowstone. And if you're interested in learning more, Harlan Patch and I wrote a book called The Lives of Bees, which covers a lot of the things that I talked about. And I'm happy to take any questions or go to the panel.
Thank you so much. First of all, thanks again to Christina. That was amazing. And I'm really excited to hear about more. So we have a panel discussion now. The moderators are going to be Erin Cadwalader. And then we have Elizabeth Hill, Gabriela Quinlan, and Claudia West. I'm not going to read their things because it's all available to you. And instead of taking up the time, let them jump in.
Great. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I just want to give Christina one more round of applause because I thought that was an amazing talk. So I'm Erin Cadwalader. I work for the Entomological Society of America. I'm not an entomologist by training, so I am just a fraud up here, but I'm thrilled to be with all of these intelligent, incredible women to talk tonight about the role of pollinators. So to kick things off, I thought we'd start with like a little bit lighter note because I don't know if you felt the same way, but if you haven't been thinking about what you're doing in your landscape with pollinators and what you can do to support them, the fall is a great time to be implementing good practices to start for next year. So I would love to hear from our panelists, kind of what are your best practices in your own yards and how do you try to maintain and support wildlife, particularly focused on pollinators?
All right, I think I'll jump in then. So I'm Claudia West, and we recommend a million different things that we can do in our gardens to our clients, to folks who own a small patch of land in DC, or to people who have sometimes hundreds of acres. There's a million things we can do that are really important to make sure in the fall that pollinators have a place to overwinter. And it starts right now with leaving some of the leaves. I know there's this cleaning frenzy that happens in every city in the fall, but as we now know, a lot of pollinators need that leaf cover. They overwinter in that. You all see probably the woolly bear caterpillar, frantically trying to find a spot to overwinter in the fall. If you take these leaves away, you're destroying an entire generation. So if you do have access to a small yard, think about not shredding these leaves with a mower, because that kills everything that's trying to hide in it. But maybe leaving a spot where this shelter and this leaf cover can stay all winter, because it's the home for someone. I think that would be a very effective way of addressing that.
Well, I like everything you said. I'm a very lazy gardener.
Oh, I love it.
Happy to leave the leaves everywhere. I'm kind of a cheapskate when it comes to doing landscaping, so I typically just take plants from my friends that are doing pollinator plant production, but I do try to focus on plants that are going to be offering resources during dearth in the fall. I try to put a big priority on that because that tends to be something that's overlooked. But you know what? You can't just do what you can, add what you can, do your best. It's going to be better than nothing.
Yeah. I think the add what you can is a really important one there, because so many American gardens have an enormous amount of mulch. Mulch is ecologically dead. I think that is one of the greatest problems we have in creating better habitat for pollinators. So if anything, it's a great excuse, long winter days, go shopping, go plant shopping. Think about what you can add to your garden to replace mulch with a functioning plant, and then have fun finding the right species.
Well, I am likewise a very lazy gardener. I, leave the leaves, certainly. And I think one thing we can think about with providing resources for pollinators is trees for bees. It's not just the plants that you put in your garden, but trees provide a ton of resources just through their massive canopies, especially early on in the season. And so thinking beyond just our garden plants is a way we can support pollinators.
Yeah, and I obviously have an advantage because we've been doing research on a bunch of plants that flower, so we know which ones to put into our pollinator meadow. But I would echo again what Gabriela said, is that when we've done our analysis at our honey and pollen diagnostic lab to see what are the bees foraging on in the spring, it's the flowering trees, and it's not necessarily the trees that have the conspicuous flowers, but things like oaks and maples, right? So keeping that in mind is really important. And we also have a solitary bee hotel that we've put up to try to encourage our native species.
Great, thank you. As a lazy gardener myself, I welcome all of these recommendations. This might have been a very self-serving question. So as we're thinking about how to take what is happening at the very local level, do you guys have guidance or recommendations on how we can take some of these practices and, a lot of the findings from the work you guys do to apply them to the larger regional, national, global kind of solutions that we need to really address some of these biodiversity decline challenges?
I jump in again? Okay. So one of the biggest challenges in our work is that efforts to increase biodiversity are often, there's a lot of hurdles in getting that through in design. Sometimes designing very biodiverse landscapes are perceived as very messy and unsightly by clients. And that can be a huge problem to overcome in the process. So one of the biggest most effective ways of addressing that is for us to build landscapes that are absolutely stunningly beautiful and meet our inherited sense of what we naturally perceive as beautiful, to keep them being built, right? That is a really important point there. And the other challenge is that in building biodiversity measures into design, there's often this misconception that this is more expensive than a more traditional approach to landscaping. And what we've been doing over the last few years is been trying to build a framework, a process that makes it harder, especially in bigger projects, for biodiversity measures to be cut later in the process, once we know how expensive a project is to build. So for example, and I spoke to Harlan earlier about this, we're working with the city of New York in developing a biodiversity metrics. It's kind of like this building here, which has certain lead points that show it's been built following very sustainable measures. We're doing this with biodiversity to anchor that so deeply in a project that it makes it almost impossible to be value engineered out of a process. So we're really thinking beyond design to build processes around that not only establish a much more deep institutional memory, but also make it harder to X certain elements that we know are key out of process in the making of a new landscape.
That's fantastic.
I think, in general, if you're thinking about gardeners or growers or people who are managing natural landscapes, just the more flowering plants you can have, the better. And then if you can pick ones that are really good for pollinators based on the science, that's even better. But just encouraging, again, being creative in how you integrate these things into landscapes is really important. But I think also a major limitation is lack of availability of these on the market, right? And the cost for some of these compared to some of your more traditional landscape plants.
Yeah, I really liked what you were saying, Claudia, about how wherever you are, you can do something, even if you have a small piece of land that you have control over. Thinking about these larger landscape questions, we are all part of a larger landscape. And so when we think about biodiversity and pollinator conservation in particular, we're thinking about sort of a metapopulation approach, right? Giving bees and other pollinators the opportunity to have different patches of habitat that they can escape stressful conditions and have the opportunity, particularly under climate change, to access climate suitable habitats, microclimate habitats and things like that. And so by creating this sort of mosaic, we can all kind of contribute to that goal of creating a landscape that is really conducive to pollinator conservation.
Great, thank you guys. So in the bigger picture of the conversations that happen regularly here with the C.V. Riley Memorial Foundation, and given that our audience really has diverse backgrounds in terms of how we're approaching a lot of these questions, I'm curious how growers can realistically integrate pollinator conservation without sacrificing yield or farm profitability.
So I love this question personally. So I think first and foremost, it's important to think about certification programs. This has become a growing trend. I do think, honestly, you might be sacrificing to some degree. There might be sacrifices that come along with it, but it can be offset by gains in your ability to access markets perhaps that you could not before because you are certified and having, a bee-friendly agricultural endeavor. So we've seen huge leaps in that from, new programs going to hundreds of thousands of acres in a matter of years. So I think that's a major way to do it. The other thing to think about is that there are a lot of different large corporations, et cetera, that are really interested in doing these types of investments. I was actually just on the phone with a large corporation last week who was like, hey, we want to put X amount of dollars towards every acre to put pollinator plantings in, right? So just looking for those types of relationships and, if it can be off-field, great. If it's on-field, those types of investments need to account for the fact that you're not going to be getting the yields off of that. But, there's also the flip side of it that, even like we're learning all the time about pollination benefits. Look at soybeans. Nobody knew that there were pollination benefits even 10 years ago. And now everybody knows that it's a 15 to 20% yield bump. So I do think there's some, unknowns there in terms of, even if it's a small bump, it might be enough to offset the cost of installation. So.
So we've had a number of students here who are from the University of Iowa, Iowa State. Sorry.
Fighting words here.
Yeah, I know. Yes, I will not say Ohio State. from Iowa State who have been pioneering this prairie strips program. And so this is where we have farmland and there's pieces of it that are sort of low productivity, but are converted into natural habitat to support or to reduce runoff of nutrients. And so those areas can be planted with pollinator-friendly plants, which then provide that additional ecosystem service of supporting our pollinators and then also supporting beekeepers to produce honey on that. So there's ways to think about the landscape. If there's an area that's not very productive and it costs you a lot to manage it, you convert it into something that can support pollinators and prevent nutrient runoff and have other ecosystem benefits.
Yeah, this is very effective. And this is usually where we look first when we work with some of our clients who own farmland or with their farmers, is we're looking at areas with really stagnant water where the yields are always really low. And these are the low-hanging fruit where we can really take the headache out of their world and do something amazing there. And the other thing, and kind of circling back to your point earlier about the importance of trees, every field is surrounded by, even if it's just a few feet of narrow woodland edge, or a piece of forest that is often overrun with invasive species and has lost its diversity. So we help landowners develop ecological intensification programs to turn up the volume in these spaces that are not even affecting their growing spaces in their farm fields. And I think that the other opportunity too is that even in hayfields or orchards that are being mowed, and we talked about this earlier, you can also integrate mowable species that will flower under the mow line. So there's all these opportunities, often in plain sight, to turn up ecological intensification and not really reduce the amount of income for our farmers.
I think turn up the volume is going to be my new talking point on the Hill, because that's such a brilliant pun. I love that.
Yeah, I think these are all excellent points, kind of highlighting how marginal lands can be used in crops that are not traditionally thought of as, pollinator dependent. But when we think about our pollinator dependent crops, as Christina highlighted in the beginning of her talk, there's so much dependence that comes from pollinators. And so when we think about sort of these yield questions, it's really this balance of not limiting our yields from a limitation of pollination services, but then also on the other hand, not limiting them from pest pressures, right? And so I think a really helpful paradigm for myself for kind of conceptualizing this is the integrated pest and pollinator kind of paradigm. And so it kind of takes the traditional IPM approach, where you're thinking about pest management from more of an integrated perspective, integrating different things like biological control, and putting pollinators within that paradigm. And so really thinking about how using these sort of more ecologically based approaches, these nature-based approaches, we can really capitalize our yields by supporting pollinators, by supporting our natural enemies through providing biodiversity.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I just add one more thing to this. I also have to be really honest with you all here today. Not all of our clients care about that. Sometimes we sneak it in, right? Sometimes we, and this is really where we as designers have to be creative. The client will only see along these forest edges, for example, this necklace of beautiful blooming understory shrubs like service berries, hawthorns, and things like that. We know what that does for ecological intensification, right? But it might not be on their agenda, but we can still build that into larger intensification plans, tree planting plans, and make a difference there because, not all of our clients have the same kind of value sets. So it's often also up to us how far we push it.
So when we were having our policy roundtable earlier today, we were talking a lot about operating in constrained fiscal environments and how to do that efficiently. I'm going to put Izzy on the hot spot right now because her last role was working as the pollinator coordinator within USDA. And so in that role, you played a really critical role helping coordinate between federal agencies with pollinator research and conservation. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how that benefited the larger community of growers and producers who either indirectly or directly benefited from the work that you were doing.
Sure, that's a really good question. So as Christina had mentioned, so just back up for a second. USDA alone has 20 offices and 14 labs that work in pollinators, all right? So it's a big, sprawly, massive investment, and for obvious reasons. And there was no coordination happening across the department level prior to the 2018 Farm Bill. And so when I came on, it was a bit of a lift, but it was welcomed, right? Like everyone knew this was a missing piece. And so it kind of fell into place. And as we started to really begin to work across the policy and programs and research and bring it all together, we started to see things like our research starting to lead to better policy solutions. I mean, I have probably a dozen examples of where this happened. Or we were able to talk to our researchers and say, hey, like there's this issue in the policy world. Can you do research to help us better understand what the most efficient next step is and which path to take? And so being able to do that on the pollinator side quickly bled into there being benefits, especially for crops that depend on pollination services, and understanding that they could then come to us, knowing that there was a point of contact to say, hey, we've got this research question, this programmatic issue, or this policy question, and is there a way you can help us with this in the pollinator realm? And the answer was, if we can't, then we're going to figure it out, right? And that really started to build bridges where there could sometimes be some consternation with certain groups, especially with the limitations that pollinator presence can sometimes put on crop production. So I think it was tremendously beneficial to have that level of organization and had major payoffs, especially in terms of those relationships.
Awesome. I really appreciate the work you did, and I think you've articulated it nicely. To the research community, are there benefits that you've seen or ways that you saw change happen after that? And I'm thinking in part, there's so much data out there, and how we wrangle all of it in a way that's efficient and beneficial is, I think, one of the biggest challenges we're grappling with in the scientific community.
So I would say it was really helpful to have this coordination because it also, there would be annual summits, right, where people would present on the different ongoing research projects in different themes. And each year there was sort of a different theme that was being followed up on. And so for me as a researcher, it was just such an amazing opportunity to see, again, the full spectrum of research that was going on and try to understand, where was the next step and where could we fit into that and who could we collaborate with to better serve our pollinators and our farmers.
Can I follow up on that really? So one other really interesting thing about the State of the Science meetings, so we had a steering committee, obviously, for an event that large, and one of the first conversations was, do we invite the commodity groups and the beekeepers as well? Because it can derail quickly when you're going on deep dives in research, and we decided to do it, and it was one of the best decisions I think we ever made. And, by the third or fourth year we were doing this, there was representation from most larger pollination dependent crop groups. So, they wanted to hear it, they wanted to engage, they understood the problems, it helped them in their own industry. So I just wanted to mention that other, tying it back to ag, there is interest in collaborating across the aisle.
I think that's very heartening to hear too. I didn't know if you guys wanted to, okay. All right. One of my next questions is, going back to kind of the global perspective, which pollinator groups are you most concerned about under future climate scenarios, and what adaptive strategies might help support them?
So we've found that each species is really responding in different ways, right? And depending on what region you're in, different parts of the year will be more or less stressful. So one example from the work that we're doing is we were trying to model out populations of orchard bees, which are spring flying bees that are used for pollination in apple orchards and cherry orchards. And Edward Amoa, who's a postdoc in my lab, sort of mapped out what, based on what we know when they emerge, how many eggs they produce in a given day, and when they're able to fly over certain temperatures. He mapped out across the state of Pennsylvania over the last 10 years what we would predict from their pollination or from their population abundance, and there is huge variation, right? So if they're emerging earlier in the year because the winters are warmer, we tend to have more frosts at the earlier in the season, and so that would knock out populations. So in Pennsylvania, these spring flying bees and other pollinators are probably very sensitive. But in other parts of the country and the world, it'll be pollinators that are out during periods when there would be extreme droughts, right? And so again, this is why we need more data to be able to really, again, understand, what are more sensitive species and where will they be experiencing those impacts.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with Christina that there is just so much variation among species. And so to answer your question, which bees am I most concerned about? Probably the bees that we just don't have enough information about. So much of the research on bees' response to climate change really comes from social bees, so bumblebees and honeybees. And those bees are actually pretty good because of their social abilities to thermoregulate their brood nest and all these other really cool things about them. They're pretty resilient. They're good flyers. They can disperse probably better than some of our super teeny tiny bees. So they have these sort of adaptive strategies that you're talking about that probably make them resilient. And a lot of them aren't doing very well. And so if they're not doing very well, then it kind of raises a red flag for how the bees that we know so much less about and who probably don't have those adaptive traits are doing. So I think I would echo what you're saying about just needing more data, more monitoring to understand what that looks like going into the future.
Can I give an example of this resiliency so our AAAS Logan Bee Lab, this was a couple of years ago, it was not even on purpose, discovered that the Mojave poppy bee had the ability to go into diapause for more than 1 year, which wouldn't we all like to be able to go into diapause for as long as we wanted? But it was, it's fascinating, and it really highlights the importance of things like the genome work to understand what genes are driving that, what is giving them this resiliency, and are there ways that, where to go from there with research. So, yeah.
Great. Sorry. Okay.
Really have an answer to any of this because we're not researchers, but the best thing we can do from our perspective is make sure that the salad bar is as stacked and open as possible, right? So we obsess really over phenology charts because when species are blooming, it's shifting, and we really look at this in great detail. We collect a lot of this information internally. We collaborate with nursery growers in the region who know their plants better than anybody to ensure that we have as much flower cover in our designs as possible throughout the entire growing season, stretching from there's still snow on the ground to way beyond the last frost. So that's really one of the few things we can do to ensure that this salad bar is stocked.
Yeah, that is a great point about sort of the changing alignments of when things are blooming and when things are thriving. In the length of time that you've been working in this industry, have you seen some of those changes? Because I'm thinking just from your bottom line, that isn't good for, your business.
I'm a plant nerd, and I've been collecting phenology data. I think I was 12 years old, so I have charts that go back before I even came to the United States. So yes, we've seen, and this is, certainly just, local data. This doesn't mean anything in the bigger context, but there are some species between now and about 20 years ago, they bloom about 3 weeks earlier. just here in the eastern United States. So there's an enormous shift that we're already seeing. We're also seeing some species not going as dormant as they used to go. And that creates problems that are not immediately, but indirectly connected to pollinator habitat. Weeds, for example, don't go as dormant as they used to, which increases maintenance cost for landscapes and then puts the burden on us again to be really clever about how we put plant systems together so that they're maintainable. Because just pollinator value is not enough if a planting fails in the real world. So there's a lot of things that are connected to this that need to line up to support these species, and it goes beyond flowers.
That's like one of the most devastating things I think I've heard in a while, and I feel like we're in the bad news business a lot of times.
There's also a lot of opportunity in this. So, yeah.
Okay, so pivoting a little bit, I wanted to thank AAAS again for organizing the events earlier today. We had a great discussion at lunch and had the student poster session. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the future of the pollinator protective workforce. So what are some of the skills or perspectives that you believe the next generation needs to confront the pollinator challenges that didn't really exist earlier in your careers?
Well, I would say that, the ability to do data science, right? And so work with these like massive data sets that, again, we're so lucky to have, but they really require a special skill set. And then again, with the rise of AI and machine learning, that gives us a lot more opportunities to, again, work with these very complex data sets.
If I could just add on to that, which I have the exact same sentiment, but so I'm in a new role where I work on all the science. And one thing that I realized that I did not quite grasp at my prior job is where the world is going with quantum computing and what's going to change. It's going to change everything, like in terms of how we do climate modeling, in terms of how we understand populations. It's going to change everything because you can take a calculation that would have taken 2 million years and do it in 2 minutes now. So I think just take some classes in quantum computing if you're a student, because I think it's going to, once they figure out the hardware and how to make it work, it's just going to change everything we know about bees and pollinators.
I mean, I'm quite early on in my career, but I think something that has stood out to me is that these really big, messy problems that we're facing now are going to really require people with very different skill sets, bringing together integrative research teams that can address questions, having experts in computer science, in data science, but also having ecologists and plant scientists to sort of ground the work and then the people to actually communicate the findings and tell the stories. And so I think having people that can be integrative in themselves and sort of speak the language and bring people together, but also people that have the really deep experience in things and, the ability to sort of borrow across different disciplines. So, with data science and with data analysis, there are fields like in ornithology that have been monitoring, populations for a very long time. And so I think, as we're thinking about monitoring our bee populations, a lot of that is coming from those other fields that are kind of a bit ahead of the curve of where we are, and the methods that they're using to monitor and to analyze their data, we're kind of picking up on. So that ability to sort of talk across the aisle and know what you don't know and bring the experts in to fill those gaps, I think is really important.
I can again only add the planting perspective here. So what I would like to say is that I'm really excited about where landscape architecture is headed. I feel like I'm sitting here representing a whole army of new talents that are rising to more powerful positions right now. People who no longer see planting as decoration, like what surrounds this building. But who see planting as essential infrastructure in our cities and beyond. Because this is part of nature. Every planting bed that we insert into a city is an epicenter to enrich an urban ecology with more of what we need to see. And we now, because of all your amazing work, can make better decisions about not only what species need to grow in there, but how they are combined together in plant systems. And I'm saying not mulch, plant mulch, but plants mingling together informed by how they grow in the wild. And it's almost like raising an international army of people who are thinking this way and starting to share more of these resources. So I'm feeling really good about where this is headed, away from ornamental horticulture to nature making.
Great. Well, I want to ask Michael if we've got any questions coming from online, and we also want to open it up to the audience to get up and ask questions. So there's 2 mics. Yeah, there's a microphone over there, so.
Me first?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was really great, Christina, and to our panel. You guys talked a little bit about data sharing and advancing bee health and conservation. A lot of questions, and you kind of answered some of them. But overall, I'm as a grad student sitting here listening to all the great things that you guys are doing, and I was just talking to somebody about I'll open up my computer and I have 50, 100 tabs of trying to figure out all this data. Oh. Thank you. Oh, sorry. My name is Erica Ibarra-Garibay. I am a PhD student at Iowa State University, and I study pollinator health. So yeah, I have these tabs open of trying to distill this information and trying to build a story with all this information that's out there. So I'm interested in knowing have you thought about or envisioned a centralized hub, almost like a big bee data marketplace that serves as a one-stop shop for specimens, genomes, monitoring data, and application tools? And if so, what would it take to build something like that?
Funny you ask. So we actually, a few years ago, started an initiative at USDA called the Pollinator Data Portal. So not to be confused with the pesticide data program, also at USDA. But that was the idea, was to bring together all of the data sets that could possibly be utilized in a pollinator platform. We unfortunately had some staffing cuts to the office that was initiating that for us. And we, it was more of a funding issue to keep, there is actually a half-built repository. But with all that said, I'm going to pass it off to Christina because Beescape has so much functionality that I took a training. I was learning how to use the Raspberry Pis, which awesome. But at that training, I learned so much about the capacity within that system. So I'm going to give it to you because I think it answers a lot of the questions and houses a lot of the data that might be of use to you.
Yeah, and so our...
Oh, no, there you go. Oh, no, it's working.
So our motivation behind Beescape was to take all of these really complex environmental data sets and put it into a format that people could easily use, right? Because it required someone with Gabriela's skill set, which is incredibly high, to be able to integrate across all of these things. And so that really, that was the motivation behind Beescape. We've actually launched a new tool called Bee Spatial, which is really designed now for researchers. That again, allows you to get this complex environmental data across the U.S. and use it for your studies. But to your larger point, of also, where can we get data on pollinator abundance and diversity, right? So right now it's all in different kinds of different projects, right? And to synthesize all of that together, there's a few groups that have done this for meta-analysis type papers, but there's really no centralized database. The closest we have are things like GBIF, right, which just tells you presence data, right, but doesn't give you all the other information. So yes, I think the National Native Bee Monitoring Lab put together a framework for what this could look like if it were funded. So.
Thank you.
Hi, Clayton Myers from USDA's Office of Pest Management Policy. I'd like to tee up a big topic that you may be able to run with in whatever lanes, but I'd love to hear your perspectives on the intersection of water as a resource. Water is, of course, an important part of the forage, whether it's from the policy or economic standpoint. So the need for water to support and maintain habitat establishment, and it's especially challenging in arid parts of the country where producers may be faced with this dilemma of diverting economic resources to divert irrigation water towards something that doesn't return yield directly, but yet may have some beneficial offsets, or maybe discuss the availability of high-quality surface water as a resource for the pollinators themselves and some of the challenges associated with that.
Seems like a question for quantum computing.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different points I'd like to make here. One is that we try to make water sources available through design for pollinators in cities, but we have to be very thoughtful about that. Because chlorinated water, which is required in cities for open water systems, is not good for any kind of creature, including us. So it's often very limited what we can do there to support different types of wildlife, just because of the chemical requirements or the filtration needed, the seasonality of it, and just the cost of maintaining safe water systems for wildlife is really high. So that's one point. The other point is that in terms of irrigation water, we're huge believers that there is a plant for any place, right? Even if it's the driest spot on earth, plants grow in sidewalk cracks without any irrigation. This is really our inspiration. So in the toughest of sites, we try to design systems in a way that don't require supplemental irrigation. It's obviously why it's very important, but there's plant pellets for the most extreme kind of environments, and there's really no need to make planting rely on constant human life support. Is just not necessary. For some public gardens, we use irrigation water during extreme drought to keep gardens looking good and keep pollinators fed, to keep flowers blooming, for example, but it should never be the baseline. It's really something that we consider an extra. It's really important. So that is just from a design perspective on water.
I'll just add, as someone who's from a state that's going to get more water, the other thing to think about is that there, like we always think about drought conditions, but we're going to experience more and more rain, and so we have to think on the other end of how do we identify plants that can put up with that as well, or try to breed and grow them.
Hi, Don Weber, USDA ARS, Beltsville. Just had a quick comment, Christina, USGS Bee Monitoring Lab, I believe that's been defunded. Our colleague, Sam Droege.
So they're part of Ecological Services, which I believe is like 1,600, 1,800 people. And I believe that entire, I don't think it's beneficial, but it's definitely been, I don't think anything's final. I could be wrong if someone knows newer information, but it definitely is being considered for being cut.
Question, so in a lot of these created habitats, wonderful insights on those, but one of the real challenges is invasive species. I mean, just in my backyard, porcelain vine, mile a minute weed, the latest is hairy crabweed, if you can believe that. This is a real challenge in what you refer to as messy, but also a sustainability and maintenance challenge. And maybe you can comment on that in terms of how do you integrate that into your planning for these habitats, which are will be both aesthetically appealing, work for the pollinators, but also be a sustainable facet of the landscape.
Thank you. That's a great question. I couldn't agree more. So invasive species are probably the greatest threat to our work and creating more pollinator-friendly habitats. And because it is the elephant in the room, it's also the beginning of our design process. We're brutally honest about the species that are on the site or expected to be there. They're lurking in the soil or in nearby areas. And the entire design process starts with what is there, How can we manage it? What are the management resources? What are the skill levels? And that essentially dictates or shapes how much biodiversity and how much elaborate design we can have in a project. So it's really the starting point. We're not asking this question after everything is designed and now how do we maintain it and is there a budget there? But we start from the very beginning. So the first thing when we start a project is we meet with the land management team, the gardeners if they're there, the clients to educate and get a feeling for how deeply they understand what is needed to keep a landscape alive. And from there, we develop a appropriate design approach. And that sometimes means that we just can't have a very colorful, big meadow, because thistle, and we talked about this earlier, will outcompete everything, or mugwort, as in other projects. And we focus on planting trees instead. So we make strategic decisions that are realistic, because we know what happens if you kick the can down the road. It'll come back to you. So thank you for that. Anybody else want to weigh in?
All right, we've got about 5 minutes left, so we'll take the next 3 questions.
Hi, I'm Jerry Epstein, and rather than give the Washington line of say, I don't speak about institution, I'm not going to tell you institution. I'm going to raise the other elephant in the room. The presentation talked about a number of federally funded infrastructures, which are crucial. We talked about NSF funding. We talked about USDA funding. We realize we don't know what 2026 funding levels are going to be, but how much of that is still standing?
I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but part of my feeling of highlighting this is because we do have such important infrastructure to support science in this country, and to help address the problems of our stakeholders. And so I think it is really essential that we maintain that and expand it.
Well, I was going to say, at least for ag, looking at the 26 approach, I mean, at least for NIFA, which is the majority of the research funding, it was pretty stable. It was a slight cut. So, that's good to know that funding will still be available, but, there's still a lot of question marks floating around.
I will also use this as an opportunity to encourage you, if you value these things, to reach out to your elected members of Congress and tell them why they are important and why sustaining funding for them matters. Congress has been trying to push back, I think, against many of the proposed consolidations and cuts, but it takes hearing from people that actually benefit from these and hearing about the work that you do and hearing about the threats of invasives and other things that threaten your states and districts about why these investments are important. Thank you.
Hi, Faniel Mwindi, faculty at Northeastern University. Question for Christina. In your talk, you mentioned there are data gaps. I was wondering if you can say more about that. Is it the quality, the amount? I keep thinking about citizen scientists, because you mentioned that they're part of the work you do. What are the limits there in terms of enacting this army that you mentioned towards the end there of people that can help track and capture even more data?
Yes. Yeah, so again, the data gaps are just in terms of we need high spatial and temporal resolution of our data, and we need, for these insect populations, there can be a lot of annual variation, so we need long-term data sets to really understand what's going on. And there is, these new-ish citizen science projects like iNaturalist, which where people are collecting images of different species, and actually at the National Academy's Status of Insects in North America group, we just heard a really great presentation from iNaturalist people and people using iNaturalist to show how these data can be used for research studies. And it really does allow us to ask more questions with more species, but it's limited because it is just presence data, right? So you know where an insect was found, but these are not organized surveys where you can say, well, I did the same effort of survey over here and I didn't find this insect, right? You just know that nobody took a picture of it over there. So that's why, these AI-enabled, automated, autonomous monitoring systems could be really great, because they would continuously monitor, and you would get all the data just as you would if you were a researcher. But again, scaling that up is it will never get to the same level as we can get with citizen science. So I think it's, again, you use these different data sources for different questions. But we do need more high quality data and longer range data to really understand these patterns.
Hi, my name is Jared Pettis. I'm a graduate student at Iowa State University. I just had curious on the panel's thoughts on when you're designing these pollinator-friendly systems, how you would balance that for honeybees and native bees, since a lot of native honeybees are not native to the United States, so a lot of native plants are plants that honeybees might not be using. I'm just kind of curious what y'all's thoughts were on something like that.
That's also a really good question. So what we do is we use the resources available to us, like Center for Pollinator Research, and a lot of the things we've learned in collaboration with some of the folks here today in working on the pollinator garden at Penn State, for example, and are really trying to balance our plant palette to all the different types of pollinator species. So we're not just gearing it for short-tongued bees, but we're also making sure that there are enough species there blooming at every time of the year for beetles, for example. So this becomes really challenging when we work in highly urban projects where we have a few square feet of planting bed and that's it. In that case, we often go to slightly more charismatic species because we also want to reconnect people with the wonders of the natural world, and that's sometimes more effectively done with the big, swallowtail butterflies than the tiny little bees. Sometimes we're really forced to being very selective in which pollinator groups we attract, but when we have the luxury of space, we try to layer from the trees all the way down to ground covers that most people won't even see because they're hiding under shrubs, under grasses, or under big flowering perennials to really fill every niche that we find with a useful species. Mm-hmm.
Just to add on to that, and following up too, so Christina, you might have recalled in her presentation, she was talking about a bumblebee study where they figured out the preference for lipid ratios. After that study came out, and we have several researchers at USDA AAAS that work in the nutritional arena, and so we had put some cogs in place, and I just want to give a shout out to Dr. Scott Hutchins quickly because of funding that he put in place. So thank you, Scott. The reason that position existed and also discretionary funds to support the research I'm about to tell you about was because of that, where we were able to go out and work with 4-H students to do pollen collection to then send to our labs to do additional analysis on what the nutritional composition was of different plants in different regions. It's not a perfect science, but it's better than nothing. And then the plan was to take that and then compare it to what, as we learn more about preferences for different bee species, how could we utilize that, especially in public lands where you often see, folks butting heads on like, can we put honeybees alongside, wild bees on Forest Service lands? Big question there. So like, would there be a way to work and put out different types of very specific species that we know would be preferred by one species, and then have other species that might be preferred by a lot of species, another species of plant that might be preferred by a different pollinator species. So try to really get specific, especially for the public lands. So I think that's another way to think about it is, if somebody doesn't like to eat hamburgers and somebody likes to eat salads, maybe give them both and they won't fight over it, right? Yeah, that was a terrible analogy, but you
All right, well, with that, we are at the bottom of the hour and we have to conclude our panel. I would like to, again, thank the Riley Memorial Foundation so much for hosting this, for AAAS, for putting us all together. Please give our panel a huge round of applause.
Thank you all so much. It was amazing. Thank you all for being here. We have a reception now right here on the second and the first floor, I guess, on the first floor, one. I'm also, just to remind you, we do have, somebody mentioned, we have a poster session in the room right here, and we will be announcing the winners of the contest of that. They're all amazing. In fact, can we give a round of applause for all the students? So stick around for that and enjoy some food and drink. Thank you.